Brussels.
Ambassador Correio do Lago graduated from the Institute Rio Branco, Brasilia. As a diplomat, he has held several functions in areas such as trade promotion, international organizations, protocol, sustainable development, energy, and climate change. He was Brazil's chief negotiator for climate change and for Rio's Plus 20 United Nations Conference, Director General at the Department of Environment and the Department of Energy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was previously Brazil's ambassador to Japan. As a diplomat, he has served at the mission to the European Union in Brussels, Brazilian embassies in Buenos Aires, Washington, D.C., Prague, and Madrid.
Ambassador Correa do Lago is the author of a series of books and articles on sustainable development and also on architecture. He is also a recognized architectural critic and was the curator of the Brazilian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture 2014 and the exhibition Brazilian Architecture Seen by Great Photographers at the Tommy Ortega Institute, Sao Paulo, and co-curator of Encore Moderne Architecture Brésilienne 1928 to 2005 at the Site de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, Paris. Mr. Correa do Lago is a member of the International Council of the Museum of Modern Art and a council member of the Oscar Niemeyer Foundation, as well as a member of the jury for the Pritzker Prize. We welcome you, sir.
We're also joined today by Professor Dr. P.S.N. Rao, Director, School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi. Professor Dr. Ashok Kumar, Dean of Academics, School of Planning and Architecture. Professor Anil Dewan, Head of Department, Architecture. Professor Arnava Dasgupta, Head of Urban Design. And Professor Manoj Mathur.
We will be in conversation with His Excellency Andre Aranath Correa do Lago on the topic Influence of Pritzker Awards and Awardees on Contemporary Architecture and Urbanism. The Pritzker Awards honor a living architect or architects whose built work demonstrates a combination of those qualities of talent, vision, and commitment, which has produced consistent and significant contributions to humanity and the built environment through the art of architecture, and is often referred to as the architecture's Nobel and the profession's highest honor.
We now welcome Professor Dr. Ashok Kumar to give the welcome note.
Thank you, Arushi. His Excellency Emmanuel Denau, His Excellency Andre Correa do Lago, Professor P.S.N. Rao, dear faculty, students, this is an event for which I have the proud privilege to welcome two international ambassadors from Brazil and France. I welcome you both, sir, to this event. These kind of events are really events of celebration of ideas. And today we are talking about ideas in architecture promoted by people who are globally recognized for their contribution to architecture. Professor Doshi from India, who has greatly contributed to the field of architecture and built environment, and his ideas will be discussed today in the panel discussion, but then we will also discuss ideas from France as well as from Brazil. Discussion of ideas is always interesting. A diversity of ideas play with each other, and that is the only way, in my view, that we can bring about new ideas, new perspectives, new discussions on even old ideas, So this is an important event from that perspective as well. Since a large number of students are attending this event, I think it would be a very useful event for them as well, because they are the fresh minds who have just entered a few years ago in the college. So from that perspective also, this is an important event. For us, I'm not an architect, so for me, these ideas would be new. At a personal level also, I aim to benefit from these discussions. With these few words, now I will hand over to the organizers. Arushi.
Thank you so much, sir. Next, we have a welcome address by Professor Dr. P.S.N. Rao.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. His Excellency Emmanuel Lenon, Ambassador of France, His Excellency Andre Aranja Correa de Lago, Ambassador of Brazil in India, faculty members of the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and dear students. It's indeed a very great event for us in this 75th year of Indian independence. Azadi Ki Amrit Mahotsav is being celebrated this year in this country. And in this mood of celebrations, we have two friendly nations with us, France and Brazil. So my warm welcome to both the ambassadors who've taken time out of their busy schedule to come here and be with us this afternoon. I think the topic of discussion is really very interesting. Pritzker Awards and Awardees on contemporary architecture and urbanism. What has been their influence? Well, architecture is, as we are all very well aware, we think architecture, we drink architecture, we talk about it several times every day. We are all passionate about architecture, and we look at architecture not just as what is happening within our country, but also what is happening in various other parts of the world, and how these styles or influences or isms, whatever you call them, how they influence our thinking. The influence of climate, the influence of culture, the influence of materials and modern technology, how these have all evolved over a period of time, and how today they are becoming a kind of an amalgamation. Well, these Pritzker Awards, of course, there will be a lot that's going to be spoken about these by the experts here. Essentially, the Pritzker family of Chicago started these awards way back in the year 1979 through the Hyatt Foundation, and it's considered to be the highest honor in this particular profession. A very large number of people have already, I think 45 persons in the past have received these awards from various parts of the world. Oscar Niemeyer received it, I think, in the year 1988, and I think Ambassador is going to talk about that. There have been people from France as well as Brazil who have received these awards, only one from India. But I think what is more important here is for us to look at how these have influenced our thinking, and where does that take us? Because architecture is not about blindly copying, because every architect wants to create something which is a kind of a mark of his or her own way of doing things. So in this profession, which is highly individualistic in its creativity, how the influence of the Pritzker Prize winners, how that is going to shape our thinking in the present day, particularly when we are talking about sustainability, sustainable development goals, urbanism, the depleting natural fossil fuel and other resources, and all those kinds of things. In the present day context, how it's going to help us. That is what we are going to deliberate upon. I can see a large number of our very young students here who have joined the profession, who are going to spend a good 4 or 5 years here. I'm sure that this is going to be very useful for them. We look forward to the enriching discussion that we are going to have in the next hour or two. So a very warm welcome once again, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we have the inaugural words of His Excellency Emmanuel Lenné, Ambassador of France.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Rao. Thank you, Professor Kumar, for welcoming us in this School of Planning of Architecture. I know how good, how reputed is that school. You have a lot of connections with French sister institutions like Belleville, like La Villette, like the University of Grenoble, and I know really your reputation. Thank you also to my dear colleague André for taking from his time. You're blessed to have him today. I mean, he is a very, very respected and talented diplomat. No issue about that. But in addition, he has nurtured a passion for architecture, and he is a member of, as said, of a most prestigious jury, and so we are very lucky to have him. And we've been asking him for quite a while. I mean, he's very much demanded for his conferences and talks. But he accepted, because we have a big festival right now called Bonjour India, with more than 300 events in 19 cities of India to celebrate the 75th anniversary of independence of India. And we thought it was very timely and important to have a special event about architecture. As you know, we have between France and India a lot of cooperation on architecture. Then we have a program, maybe some of you belong to it, called UDAP, Young Urban Designer and Architect. To a program of invitation where you can spend up to 6 months in France, in a studio or in a university to study and to further your practice. But we thought this event was also very important because all of you in the coming years, you're going to work in India and you're going to have a major, major role for your country and I would say for the planet. India is likely to be the place where architects will be very much requested in the next 2-3 decades. According to the figures, but you know that, in the next 2 decades, there should be something like 300 million new urban dwellers in India, which means if we want the city to be livable, we will need some genius and some great architect. And we really expect the best from you. So I'm sure this lecture today is going to enlighten us. I hope that André will talk about Pritzker Prize, about Pritzker architects, but I hope you will devote some of its talks to French architects who have been also awarded this prestigious prize. I mean, we had Christian de Porzampar, for example, we have Jean Nouvel, and we have more recently 2 great architects, Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal, and I'm sure that André will take some time also to introduce you to their work. So thank you very much to him for coming, and now I give him the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your words. We hope we can stand up to your expectations of us as designers and architects. Now, you may all please take your seats so that we can begin with the lecture. I would like to call upon His Excellency Andre Arana Correa do Lago, the Ambassador of Brazil in India.
Good afternoon to all. Thank you very much for this invitation. The first that I have to thank is the French ambassador, because this initiative of Bonjour India is really wonderful, and I believe that it is the kind of project that very few embassies can do that, and France knows how to work its soft power in the best possible way. So congratulations for this program, and thank you for your words. Professor Rao, I'm very honored to be here. I spoke in this hall 2.5 years ago before the pandemic, and I'm very happy to be able to be back after those 2 very difficult years. So before I start showing some photographs, and I'll show them quite quickly, I want to say a few words. First, that the main idea of this presentation is to focus on France, since obviously it's Bonjour India. But the more I worked on this presentation, the more I saw how France is a link also between Brazil and India. So I want to present here some elements that somehow can be considered coincidences, but they are not, because of the very important and influential effect that France had on architecture on the 20th century. So I would like also to say a few words about climate change and all these issues that everybody has to take into consideration today for architecture. As the ambassador of France said, we have to support in whatever way India to build the best possible cities, because you have 2 enormous challenges. One is that you are a country that is still a majority of your population is in the countryside. And since I was a negotiator of climate change, I can tell you that the solution for climate change is to have the largest possible population in urban centers. In fact, in dense urban centers. So density is a characteristic that is extremely important for us to be able to combat climate change. And India has this fantastic challenge ahead of it, and I think that you will all have lots of jobs, and one of the things that I believe that has helped some of the countries that got the Pritzker Prize to have so many good architects is the influence of the state. In which sense? Not only in having competitions for important buildings, but also in creating standards of quality, be it for schools, for museums, for roads, for low-income housing. So I think this is the main object of architecture today, is that you be able to put together, and I will talk about Lacaton et Vassal at the end, to put together what really makes a city sustainable, which is a city that makes sense socially, economically, and environmentally. This balance, each country has a different one, because some countries it's hot, others are cold, others have lots of people. And I am sure that India is going to be an extraordinary example in its efforts towards not so quick, but as quick as possible urbanization. So the Pritzker Prize, as was well introduced by the speakers before me, yes, it is a prize that in the beginning was relatively modest from the point of view that there was never an international prize of architecture since the 50s. but the Pritzker Prize has succeeded to become what is called now the Nobel Prize of Architecture. So obviously it's a great honor for me to be in the jury. And the jury normally, and I think this is one of the key reasons for the success of the Pritzker Prize, is that it's always half architects and half non-architects in the jury. So it always takes into consideration what the other side thinks about architecture, because architects, like diplomats, if we're going to judge ourselves among ourselves, we're going to have a very biased view. And somehow the strength of the Pritzker Prize is not to be a vision only of architects. The prize has been criticized for reasons and has been lauded for others, and I think we're going to have a discussion after. I just want to say that obviously it has contributed to the idea of the star architect, because somehow architects believe that they have to have the Pritzker Prize to have access to some kinds of projects. But it also creates a standard and creates also the perception that there are many contemporary architectures. And I think this is extremely important, because in the post-war there was a bit of tendency, and because of the SIAM of the Congress of International Architecture, that there was one way or a limited way of doing architecture. I believe that the Pritzker Prize has contributed to show how different architectures can be exceptional and can receive the prize. I have to say that before the Pritzker Prize, there had only been one international prize with a strong monetary contribution and with a very good jury in the 50s, and ironically, it was in Brazil. It was the Bienal of São Paulo that created the first prize of architecture, but it was only given 4 times. But the first one who got is Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier is a key figure for India, for Brazil, and obviously for France. And he's one of the links that we have, so I will mention his name quite often, and you will understand why. I'm going to go through some photographs. I just say next, yeah, next, yeah, no, yeah, next. Thank you. So I'm going to concentrate on the prize that was given to one Indian, the prize was given to 2 Brazilians, and the prize was given to 3 French. So I will concentrate on the 3 French, I believe, because of Bonjour India, but I will try to also show how France enters even in some of the others. So Mr. Doshi got in 2018. He was the first Indian to receive. Niemeyer received very early in 1988. Paulo Mendes da Rocha in 2006. And as the Ambassador of France mentioned, Paul Zampar received very young in 1994. Nouvel received already a very, very famous architect. And now Lacaton and Vassal received the prize, which was somehow a surprise. So I'm going to start with the Doshi. Next. Thank you. So this is a less famous work of Doshi, but I think it's an amazing museum in Ahmedabad, and a bit to show the variety of works he has. The great advantage of someone who makes a presentation on architecture nowadays is that everybody can go into Google and see whatever they want. So the images are just a provocation. I am not going to go in the overall work of the architects. I just want to stress some differences or some characteristics that I believe are very good. And why I chose this one? Because the link of Doshi to Le Corbusier is that he lived in France and he was an architect that worked with Le Corbusier. So concrete is an absolute key element of his work. Next. This is also a very strong project in Ahmedabad, as you know. It's the Prema Barry Hall from 1976. Now it's an abandoned theater, but it's an amazing ruin. You know that Eero Saarinen, a wonderful American architect, used to say that it's during the construction of a building you see if it's going to become a beautiful ruin. It's very important for architecture to become a beautiful ruin, as we all know. So it is a ruin today, but it is a very, very strong, again, exercise in concrete. Next. And the School of Architecture, that's famous as SEPT in Ahmedabad, with, I believe, maybe 2 of the 10 most beautiful stairs in the post-war at the entrance of the SEPT. I don't need to talk to you about that. Next. And obviously his office, which he has been developing for the last 30 years, Sangat, where he has his studio and where an incredible ambiance of young and less young architects work together. Has any of you been to Sangat? Yes, fortunately, good. Next. And one of the elements that was more considered by the Pritzker is the fact that Doshi is one of the first architects to design anticipating spontaneous changes. This is a very important concept. Why? Because in modern architecture, people, many architects think that they can control everything. And in fact, it's very hard to control the client, be him rich or be him poor. But if you incorporate into your architecture a percentage of possibility of movement, this was very much succeeded by Doshi. Next. As you probably have visited the Aranya complex, which has a kind of architecture for low income that is extremely respectful of the opinions of the persons that live in it and of the expectations of the basic housing that you can have in India. Next. Come back to that, I'm sorry. It was in disorder. No, you can go, you can go. No, next. Yeah, next, this is, as you know, is Sangat. Next, please. But one of his most stunning buildings, and I hope you have been to, is the IIT in Bangalore. Who has been to the IIT in, good, fantastic, I don't need to talk about that. The IIT in Bangalore is really an extraordinary building. And it was built for a series of years, and I'm just going to show some of the, this is one of the early buildings. Next. At the same time, you can have this very rigorous, very elegant angles. Next. Circulation is particularly brilliant and taking into consideration the climate, obviously. Next. And the new buildings, some of the new buildings that are not next to the, are not in the main complex, are particularly original, like this residential part. Next. The housing of the director. Directors also deserve to be well treated. No, I suppose that you agree. Next. And these are the most recent buildings that he did in the complex. Next. But this is my favorite angle. Why? Because it has monumentality, but a monumentality that takes into consideration the climate, the practical circulation in the place, and also the plants that give a bit, is the spontaneous change, no? That incorporate and give a new dimension to the building and makes it age extremely well. Next. But his originality, as you know, is very strong. This is that fantastic work with Hussein that he painted inside, and Doshi did this very, very particular building. So the originality of Doshi, and how at the same time he could deal with low-income housing, with a prestige project like that, university building that have very successful, that are very well rated by those who use it, and obviously the IIT, which forms some of the most brilliant Indians, and by the way, for those who didn't watch, is probably the most filmed building of modern architecture in a movie. No? The Three Idiots is completely filmed in the IIT of Bangalore. So for those who like architecture and haven't seen it, it's a must. Next. So, Oscar Niemeyer is the first Brazilian to win, as I told you. Niemeyer was a very prolific architect who died, as you can see, 104. So, yes, architects live very long. You chose the right job if you like that. And Niemeyer started as a young architect, working with whom? With Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was called to Rio de Janeiro to do the Ministry of Education. This is a 1936 building, and in fact, it's the first glass stall building in the world. So, it introduced many elements, among which this very high pilotis, and the fact that symbolically a government building was not interrupting the passage, was not isolated. On the opposite, the public could go through the building. And at the same time, Brazil developed for that project with a brilliant garden designer, Burle Marx, a kind of tropical garden that totally incorporated and somehow made modernism less radical. No? So, going quickly through Niemeyer, next. In '39, he did the Brazilian pavilion in New York that had all these elements of curves that became his trademark. Next. In '41, he built a new neighborhood in Belo Horizonte, Pampulha, and this, again, with tropical plants, with elements of traditional Brazilian architecture like azulejos, Portuguese styles, and curves. Next. Always integrating with Burle Marx. This is a house in Rio. Next. And the capacity that is quite unique in the 20th century to create symbolic buildings for a new capital, and very symbolic buildings that even a child can draw. Symbolic buildings that people had to adopt, because suddenly in 1960 we had the new capital and Brazilians had to recognize themselves. And he created icons that were very strong in first glance for everybody, and obviously that can be appreciated by architects as they go to the details. Next. This is the presidential palace in Brazil, in which he designed there has to be a balcony in a presidential palace, so but the balcony in fact is a building, independent building. So there is how to make modernism something that is that really contributes to the monumentality and to the easy recognition of a building. Next. Then he went to France. You see, I promised the ambassador of France that I would talk about France as much as possible. But please note how many times I said the word France already. Please. Niemeyer has some issues with the military regime in Brazil, because he was a communist. He was openly communist. And he leaves to France and to Algeria in the 60s. And André Malraux, the Minister of Culture of France, gives him an authorization to be an architect with the same rights as a French architect. So this is a house for the Mondadori editors in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat in France. This is from 1967. Next. But his most famous work in France is the Communist Party of France in Paris. That is absolutely amazing in all the detailing. He created the furniture, he created everything for that building. Next including the meeting room of the Communist Party, which is absolutely the envy of all the other parties. Next. In the 80s, he did mostly prefabricated schools, something very much when he went back to Brazil, very social projects. And next, finally, in 1990, when he was already almost 90, he designed a new museum in Rio that became an icon of the city and became an icon of the renewal of modernism. As you don't know because you're very young, but the professors remember there was a moment of postmodernism. And when people got tired of postmodernism, they suddenly discovered Niemeyer was still alive and was doing modernist things. And this became an icon of the anti-postmodernism that came after. Next. And just to be optimistic about old age, since you're all going to die very old because you're architects, he designed this hall. He was 100 and the artist was 97. So believe in you, you're going to go very far. Next. Paulo Mendes da Rocha. I just want to mention that the most recent project of Niemeyer, who died, as you know, but he left a project that has just been built in the Chateau Lacoste, which is a museum of contemporary art in the south of France, and the most recent pavilion is a Niemeyer pavilion. I mentioned France again, as you know. Paulo Mendes da Rocha, it's going to be difficult because he, although he's very much influenced by Le Corbusier, the Niemeyer generation in Rio de Janeiro, the city where I come from, is very much influenced by the early Le Corbusier. So the Corbusier of the 20s, the Corbusier of the 30s. As you all know, Le Corbusier in the 50s enters into a much more, 40s and 50s, much more brutalist architecture. And in fact, this new school of architecture in Brazil is based on the brutalist phase of Le Corbusier. Paulo Mendes da Rocha won the Pritzker in 2006. And he is a very special architect, which is more of an old-fashioned architect. In which sense? When you look at his work, and he died last year, it's very difficult to know in which year he built it, because he has an amazing coherence in all his work during the years. So just a few photos. That is his own house. Next. This is a pavilion of Brazil in Osaka Fair in 1970. Next. A house in São Paulo. Next. That's the 80s. The restoration of an abandoned building that now is a major museum in São Paulo in the 90s. This is the building that revealed him to the world. Next. This is the same building. Next. And a very important cultural center in Vitória, a city 1,000 miles from Rio. Next. And as you can see, he has a vocabulary that is very somehow repetitive, but used with an extraordinary dynamism. Next. And this, for instance, just to show a church of his in which the work has to be seen reflected in the water. So he has an extreme originality in a very limited vocabulary that he imposed to himself. Next. So now we go to the French. When Christian Portzamparc wins the Pritzker, it was quite a surprise. He was born in 1944, as you see. When he gains the prize, it was a big surprise because suddenly people noticed, God, he's the first French man to receive the Pritzker Prize. And the Pritzker had already been given to many people. Somehow he represents a generation that was very much influenced to a boost to new architecture provoked by the state. So in this case, Les Hautes Formes, it's housing, middle low class housing in Paris, in the middle of the postmodern phase, but in which he's extremely moderate in the sense of postmodernism, but in which he breaks the urbanism of low-income housing, which, as you remember, were the blocks that were very little attractive, and there was already a great reaction against that. So Christian Porzenpach wins this competition and wins a series of competitions in France, and becomes very young, a very relevant architect. Next. This is the same project of apartments, 209 middle-income apartments. This is 1975, 79. So it was ready in the center of postmodern. Next. Another competition he won was for the Cité de la Musique, which is an urban renewal of an area of Paris in which you would have schools, you would have very important cultural centers, and somehow he adds even a certain degree of humor in his architecture, because he takes elements from modernism, he takes some elements from more traditional architecture, and he gives it a dimension that was not taken so seriously by many architects at the time. And when he gets the prize, and by the way, I'm going to make some comments about the comments of the jury, no, for why they gave the prize to the architects. This element of surprise, which the jury considered linked him to Brazilian architecture. So there are two reasons for that. The main reason is that he's married to a French woman, to a Brazilian woman, Elisabeth de Porzenpach, who does the interiors of his building. And so he would go very often to Rio, so he knew very well the work of Oscar Niemeyer. But the other dimension is obviously that he enjoyed it very much and he knew how to interpret it. Next. Whoops. Yeah, that is also the same project. This is from 84 to 1990. So you see, there are elements of postmodernism, there are elements of certain French classicism, but you can also feel Le Corbusier in it. So he was like a new interpretation of the tradition. And one of the elements that the jury mentioned in his citation is that countries like India, like France, like Italy have a huge weight of history, which is something that we were much more comfortable to be innovative in Brazil because we had much less historic architecture. But countries that have strong architecture have a tendency to respect maybe too much the past. Next. This is one of my favorite projects of his, and it's in Luxembourg. It's the Philharmonic of Luxembourg. This is from 97 to 2005. Next. And this building reveals very much the originality of his plans and how he became somehow, and this is one of the great successes of his, to integrate acoustics into the architecture. I mean, not to do the architecture and then you call the acoustics guy and he tries to correct what you did. No, he incorporates the way that all the sides, the seats on the sides become themselves, the structures, no, become themselves acoustic elements. Next. And the small theater is this one, in which you see this very daring way of putting acoustic elements that have a very strong architectural feeling. Next. This is the exterior, how you enter that Philharmonic. Next. And again, something that you cannot define very well which architecture this is. I mean, is this, it has obviously elements of architecture, but you never had hundreds of pillars like that, except in Ranakpur, by the way, where I went 2 months ago, where I have 1,400 pillars. But anyway, next. And one of his most important recent projects is in Rio de Janeiro, in my city in Rio, which is this enormous cultural center called the City of the Arts. Next. Again, highly complex plan with with lots of curves, with lots of open spaces in between. Why? Because the climate of Rio is very mild. And the other element that he understood very well is that he suspended the building so that it would have the view to the sea, because it was not directly on the sea. Next. This very, very complex program, it took quite a long time to build it, almost 10 years from 2000, but it's a project of 2002, open in 13. Next. This is the side. Next. And again, the interior, one of the small concert rooms with extremely original acoustic elements. And I have to say, Elisabeth, his wife, acted very strongly always in the interior of his buildings. Next. And as you see, between all the theaters, you can circulate openly, which is something that you could never do in a European cold place, because during the winter you have to put your coat, take out your coat, etc. And he really adapted it extremely well to the Rio climate. Next. Jean Nouvel. Jean Nouvel was born basically the same year as Christian Porzampar, but Jean Nouvel was already an extremely famous architect when he was chosen for the Pritzker Prize. And I'm going to use a little some of the words that was used by the jury. One of the elements that everybody, I think, respects in Jean Nouvel is his courage, because he loves to take risks in all his projects. So even when they gave the prize, they say with uneven results, because there are some buildings of Nouvel that you may love and you yourself may hate, particularly some others. But the fact is that most of his buildings are at least extremely interesting and are a progress for architecture. So he, contrary to Paulo Mendes da Rocha, he's not interested in a unified approach. And he starts to exploit with this building, which is his first famous building, the Institut du Monde Arabe, the Institute of the Arab World, from 81, 87, again, a competition promoted by the French government that he won. He starts to exploit light like probably no other architect in the post-war has succeeded to do. Next. In this building, he, to have a reference to what you call the jalis, no? Or Arab lattice work, he has these very Arab elements, aesthetic element, but controlled by a system that opens and closes them electrically according to the intensity of the light. So it's a highly sophisticated. This is probably, if you can say that an architecture is high-tech, this is definitely high-tech architecture. Next. But he plays not only with that, but he plays also with the transparency, like very few architects at the time. So in 87, he becomes world famous with this building. Next. 2 years later, he makes the Fondation Cartier for contemporary art. And when you have a first look, you don't see so much. It's a glass building, but that is his interest. In the first moment, it's just one more glass building in Paris. Next. But in fact, in the Fondation Cartier, he starts to mix, and you'd never know very well where is the garden and where is the interior of the building. So not only light, but also this transition between garden and the building. Next. And his glass facade is like disappearing, or on the opposite, appearing. And whatever angle you look at this building, you will discover this effect that you don't know very well. Why is this facade continuing? But there are many reasons we can debate after, but it is a building that stands and very clearly is a contemporary art center by its own appearance. Next. A little after that building, in 1999, he builds the Musée on the Quai Branly. It's close to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Again, it's an international competition, and the French wins the international competition for this major museum, which has also a very curious, completely useless, theoretically, glass facade that introduces you to a garden. So when you enter the museum, you pass through a glass facade, and you enter a garden, and then you discover the museum. And the museum has a very particular way of being developed, because it was developed specifically for the collection, which is a collection of what used to be called primitive art. But here, he introduces this, probably the first significant green wall of a major architect. Now it's a very fashionable thing, but at the time when he did this, so he broke, Jean Nouvel broke the border between what is garden and what is the building also. And in Paris, both buildings in Paris. Next. But probably he's going to be remembered all over the world for the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. The Louvre in Abu Dhabi, as you know, is an agreement with the Louvre Museum in Paris, where some collections of the Paris Museum go to Abu Dhabi, and he developed a project that we can talk hours about, because as he says, it's 1,000 architectures that enter into a project like that. But obviously this cupola, which symbolizes somehow Western architecture, but is a cupola again with elements that you recognize much more from an Arab architecture. And it has 9 layers of these objects that are put together. Next. But it's not only the cupola. Look at the plan of this building. Look at the complexity of this building, by the way, built on water. And this cupola it is somehow like a cupola over a village, creating a kind of space that is particularly adapted to the climate, obviously, of the place, but also to give some kind of movement also between boxes. Why? Because most of the art that is exhibited there is high quality and highly priced art that have to be in very protected context. Next. And it becomes also from the outside a landmark for Abu Dhabi, which needs many. And you have here an idea of that mix between the village and the spectacular and very functional cupola of 9 layers. Next. But then I talked too much about France. No, I talked too much about France. Now, Jean Nouvel in Brazil. He just finished this building this month. It's a new hotel in São Paulo, in which you can see Jean Nouvel evolving in what I was telling you, this border between garden and the building at all levels, and in a very difficult to build area of São Paulo, where you could not cut a single tree, where you could not destroy a single building. It's an old hospital that has become now a cultural center and a hotel. Next. So, Lacaton and Vassal. Lacaton and Vassal are a couple, a woman and a man, who have been working together for many years, and they have a special kind of architecture that is very different from Portzamparc or from Jean Nouvel. Is that, as the citation of the jury says, the essence of their architecture is the democratic spirit. So they want to add technology to be ecologically responsive and not as an aesthetic effort. So it's very, very different. So it is a renewal of the spirit of modernism in the sense that you're coming back to the main reason of modernism, which was functionalism, no? So you come back somehow to functionalism with new technology and obviously taking into account the climate emergencies, etc. So economy of means for them is one of the greatest qualities you can mention on the building. So this is a house, one of their early houses that had to be very inexpensive because the clients had very few means. So this is from 1991 next. So it is a house that uses very simple materials, very easy to obtain materials, and in standard sizes. So this, when you open the house, next, when you completely open the house, and in the back, where you have the morning sun next, you have this box of polyethylene plastic that is an additional space to the house with the very low cost. You practically double the living space of the house. You have a system of opening it for when the climate changes, for when it's summer, etc. But the fact is that this house was, how do you give more space for low cost? And this is an obsession of Le Caton et Vassal. Next. This I'm showing also because when they have to do a house that is a beautiful house, also quite low cost, it's only 180 square meters on the coast of France. Next. This is in Cap Ferret. It's not Cap Ferrat, it's in Bassin d'Arcachon. This is from 1998. They built a completely elegant house. They show how you can build a completely elegant house with extremely low-cost material and standard sizes. Next. With a beautiful site. Next. But their most famous works are for low-cost housing. In France, they call HLM, which are the buildings that are built by the state or by the mayors or whatever, that have regulated aluguel, loyer, rent, limited rent. So this one is from 2011. Next. And their solution was to have the smallest possible impact in the neighborhood. This is a completely built from scratch building, but then I will concentrate on their second main obsession. The first main obsession is to give more space to low-income housing. So why do people have to live in 40 square meters? No? Second, transparency. Why do you have to have so many walls, limited windows? People don't see the time passing, the different seasons going through. Next. But their central uniqueness, let's say, is when they have to build something in a place where there is already a building. So La Caton et Vassal don't destroy buildings. If they have to build something in a place where there is a former building, they use the structure and they use the building as much as possible. So this is a FRAC. It's one of those great art center and cultural center that France's government promotes. This FRAC is an old boat warehouse. Needed much more space, so they kept the original building and built next to it a completely modern building for the other activities, cinemas, exhibition spaces, etc. with modern technology and attached to the other. They consider that destruction is crime, which is a fascinating dimension, because the garbage of construction sites is one of the most serious provokers of climate change. Few people know that, because obviously construction companies don't like this to be known. But the truth is that, for instance, in a country like Japan that has fabulous architects, but the average life of a building in Tokyo is 25 years. So every 25 years, you completely destroy a concrete building, and all these materials is thrown somewhere, and you have completely useless emissions, both in the construction and in the destruction. So, Lacaton et Vassal, next, please. Lacaton et Vassal try to do this. Is in the new building, as you see, very simple, standard, high-tech, cheap high-tech, next. And the meeting of the two buildings, next. But what made them quite famous, and again, thanks to an international competition, was when they were asked to restore the Palais de Tokyo. Palais de Tokyo is a very important museum of modern art in Paris that lost a bit of its sense when they built the Beaubourg by Piano and Rogers. And to redirect the function of the Palais de Tokyo, which is a 1937 building, Art Deco, very Art Deco, their project, compared to the others, first was much cheaper, and second, it was basically to take away all the decoration, all the superfluous Art Deco decoration that you had in the building. So their project, which was very much appreciated, why? Because this is a center essentially for contemporary art, and contemporary art, as we all know, goes very well with open, old buildings that you put the installations in it. Next. And so they stripped the Palais de Tokyo from the decorative dimension, next, and became instantly quite famous. This is their most recent building in Geneva, again, low cost. The first floors are office buildings to give like a sustainability and an economic point of view to the rest of the building, and low cost housing on the top, next. And with their obsession with more space, they always succeed to transform these apartments in much more attractive apartments, even more, because one of the advantages of these tall buildings, these low-cost tall buildings, is the view, because they have an amazing view. And when they built it in the 50s and 60s, they had small windows, and nobody related to them. Next. And their most famous work, these are old buildings from the 60s, that they were asked to build new ones. They didn't destroy the buildings, they just built in front and in the back terraces, almost doubling the apartments and opening the windows and creating a club on the top. Next. So this is again, this exercise of an architecture that is just an addition. It's an architecture that doesn't call the attention. I mean, you're on the road, you're not going to say, wow, that's amazing. But the more you see the ecological, economic, and social impact of this architecture, you understand why they got the Pritzker Prize. Thank you very much. Now the debate.
Thank you so much, sir. I think I speak for everyone when I say that we are all walking away today with a much broader and insightful vocabulary about all the different examples of contemporary architecture across the world, and see how various geopolitical, cultural, and ethnographic factors influenced all these built structures. Now, we would like to call the floor open for discussion. I request Professor Manoj Mathur and Professor Arunavad Dasgupta to join us on stage.
Check.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I think I speak for everyone here when we say that we were so completely engrossed in the presentation by Ambassador that we didn't realize that we have overshot the time, but nonetheless, there are some important questions which come to mind, and I'm sure all of you also have some questions. So still, we thought it's a good idea to have some discussion here. So just before we actually start the discussion, I have to just make my 2 bits heard here. So these days a big word in all our lives is convergence. If you just go over that word, you'd find it here everywhere. We are talking about convergence, how various things in the world are coming together, how science is related to art, how the East is related to West, and how one can't be without the other. So everything is coming together. We are all one. The whole world is one. And we are converging. And here is an example of convergence, right here. So when I speak about this person, I do not know how to describe him, because he's, on one hand, he's ambassador. On the other hand, he's Pritzker Awards jury. On the other, he is connoisseur of art. And of course, he's also the husband of a very lovely person. So yes, I am so delighted to be with this very convergent man, almost like a Renaissance man. And with that, I would just start the discussion by throwing up my ball, and maybe Aruna after that can pick it up. So I would just point out here that of late, and I would say particularly in the last 4 or 5 editions of the Pritzker, there has been a very perceptible change in what you award for. So specifically, I would say that one of the things which has happened very clearly is that you have moved out of the Eurocentric vision, which for some reason had continued for many, many years. And when you stepped out to Japan or some place like that. But now you can say Pritzker is going places. So what has prompted that is what I personally have as a question, and maybe Aruna, you can build upon that.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's lovely, first of all, to be a part of this convergence, and it's already a convergence of 3 nations: France, Brazil, and India. It's a convergence of institutions of all kinds. We are sitting here in this auditorium, listening to you and listening to all others who have spoken before you. But there are many others who are already getting connected through YouTube from across India and across the world. And I think that itself shows how strong these events have ripples beyond what is going on. I also felt it's extremely a great opportunity for us to see how you interpret the work of these great architects, their contribution through architecture, and you've shown us examples of it. And as a jury member, how you have seen their work influence other ways of how architecture gets produced and gets expressed. One of the aspects that we keep asking ourselves when we look at architecture in a broader sense within societies, and especially like you said, that India has to look at the cities very carefully, and how architecture makes cities, and how cities influence architecture. It will be nice to understand whether in this environment we are looking at this broader connection of architecture and urban society, right? And how does architecture play that larger role than just producing the unit of the building, right? And I would be very happy to hear that dimension of interpretation by Pritzker. Thank
So before there are the questions, I to agree with to agree with you regarding the convergence. And the convergence today is thanks to France. And I think that France gives this example constantly of the importance of the state in the quality of architecture. So if you look at the architecture of the past, be it in India or being even in Brazil or whatever, you have lots and most of the buildings were either for religious reasons, for war reasons, no, the forts, or for the powerful. So I think that the introduction of architecture into everyday life is somehow an element that is relatively recent and is extremely important that it be regulated somehow. But regulated is not creating aesthetic regulation, but regulation in the sense of making sure that the building fulfills its function. No? So I believe there has to be, you continuing to use your convergence, this convergence between the city and the building. There was a very nice Argentinian architect who was a charming man, Cesar Pelli. He was a member of the jury like 30 years ago that wrote a beautiful book. By the way, I recommend it to all architecture students. It's called Conversations on Architecture. It's been published in English in America. He was the dean of the Yale School of Architecture. And he has a very simple thinking that I believe goes very much into your question, is that he says that the building cannot belong only to the user, because the person who builds the building, by the way, doesn't look at the building. It's everybody else that has to look at the building if you are in a city. So if you build something, you cannot decide what is the look of that place and the impact of that place unless it is hidden in the middle of a garden and nobody can see it. But when you are adding an element to the urban fabric, this has to be thought in a much more open way. In which way? I believe that what Lacaton and Vassal do and what Alejandro Aravena does too, he is the president of the jury at the moment, he is a Chilean, and also Doshi used to do, is a new element that is essential in architecture, is listening to people, listening to who is going to use that building, listen to the street, listen why people are unhappy that there's going to be a new building in the street. I remember when I was young in Rio and they started to build very tall buildings in small streets. As a passerby, I just thought, well, it's having some consequences. It had huge consequences because you triple the number of cars that goes to that place, you triple the number of people walking in that place, you triple the necessity of shops in that place. So the impact of a building has to be very much regulated. I know that for developing countries like ours that had this impressive increase of population, it is somehow difficult to spend more time consulting people. But I think it's a very natural thing in India and a very natural thing in Brazil that you want the users to have an opinion about that. And as democracies, we know that everybody can complain and even stop some projects. But somehow, sometimes Europeans don't notice that the challenge we have is that we multiplied by 4 our population since 1945. So India and Brazil both multiplied by 4 their population. France, I'm citing France because it's France, only doubled its population since Napoleon. In 200 years, they doubled their population. So the impact on the cities, the impact on the street, the impact on the number of schools, of hospitals, of roads, cannot be compared to ours. So first of all, I think that we are amazing because we deal with this explosion of necessities and starting from a base that we didn't have even for a very small portion of the population in the 40s. So I believe that there is, I think that the more you consult people, the better you make your city. And I believe that's why I'm such a fan of Lacaton and Vassal because, and of Alejandro Aravena and of Doshi, is because they are the ones that have called the attention that it's not about the client, it's about the user. It's about the city, it's about the street, it's about the neighbors. And I think it's a lesson for all the architects that are acting or architects to be here.
Continuing on that same theme, the latest edition, which is of Francis Kere, having a person who's not European and whom you have recommended for the Pritzker for works which were not done in Europe, seems to be a big leap from how you were awarding earlier. So how has this change happened? How has this new thought come in?
Look, it's quite interesting that the Pritzker insists, and I just noticed that by preparing this, is every time that they have the, where they have the opinion of the jury, no, because at the end when we give the prize, there is an explanation of why the prize was given. So in these explanations, which are called the jury citation, there is always the list of the jury. And it's interesting that for Ports-en-Parc, and I hadn't noticed that, Charles Correa was in the jury. Yeah. After Doshi was also in the jury for some of them, but in the case of the three French, it was Charles Correa. Ratan Tata was in the jury until recently also. So the Pritzker, the Pritzker family says that the jury is very important for its diversity and it has a strong influence on the choice. I think that the chairs have, in general, not been architects, except for recent years. So you have a dynamic that is different because the people are changing. No? Obviously, I'm highly suspicious to answer your question because I've been in the jury for 5 years. So I would enter into your category, but it's a coincidence. But the fact is that there is, I think, a very strong sense of contemporariness of the choice. You have to choose architects that are really, at that moment, making a difference. And not being like the prize, it is for a life achievement. As you know, the Pritzker Prize is given to, not for one work, but for a series of works. But if you give it to a guy or a lady that is very young, obviously it's going to change her life, which happened to Zaha Hadid, for instance. Zaha Hadid had only built 3 small buildings when she got the Pritzker. But history shows that the choice was very good because she had amazing projects, and you all probably studied her drawings. But at the time it was highly criticized because, wow, but she has built so little, how can they give the prize? But because the jury, that specific jury, identified that there was in that person an extraordinary potential. She was a woman born in Iraq. So in principle, her curriculum is a very surprising curriculum also, no? And very young. So I think that Zaha Hadid's choice was one of these changing moments in the Pritzker. Because before, since it was a new price, you could give to all the architects that were like 75 to 90 or whatever, that were very important. But then at a certain moment that you had the obvious, then you could look for those who are having contemporary impact.
As I also see it, and the way we saw it in the works here, there seems to be two kinds of shifts that these works represented and the history of Pritzker also showcase. One of the shifts could be this, the excellence and the ingenuity shown by architects and their work through the self-expression of form, materiality, structure, and technology, right? Where, especially with concrete, one was able to do wonders, and those wonders are the ones that we could see then and for a long period after. So there is this idea of creativity through exploring the architectonics of architecture. And from that, we see now that there is this shift, as you talked about Lakatos and Vassal, who's now talking about the principle of the second architect, an architect who has already done something, and now, as an architect myself, I see the work that has happened before, and I would like to now add to it and extend it and make it more than what it was, or even find new meaning to it, right? It is no longer then only my individual expression from scratch to the end, but it is a reflection of someone who has preceded me, and that someone could be anyone. The state could be the builder, could be the person who has himself built their own houses, right? And the city, who is the architect preceding this one architect, right? And that seems to be a chain of discussions that are getting generated. There's also this simultaneous exploration of from the idea of the self to the idea of the multiple, right? To be able to engage with more and many rather than only me and my expressions. So I felt that is a nice shift that we could start seeing from now onwards recently, right? And I see that as a very beautiful trend that we can keep thinking about, right? Because no longer are we then only talking about the iconic. We are also celebrating the everyday, right? With the iconic. Yeah. I don't know what you think, but that's the way I could read what I saw.
I totally agree. In fact, architecture is much more complicated for your generation than for the previous generation, because you have new elements that have been incorporated. So it was not only about technology, because in the 50s and 60s everybody was fascinated by technology, but the social element, the environmental element didn't exist. And then there is another thing that I discovered living in Japan, which is quite interesting. We have to say that Japan is the country that has more Pritzker Prize winners, more than the US, more than any other country. And all those who love architecture understand that very well, because we all have our favorite Japanese architects. But one interesting thing, how they solved some issues that, for instance, in Brazil we haven't. One of the problems we have in Brazil is how construction companies hire architects for themselves and build what they want to build, because these architects have to do what the company wants. So there is no autonomy of the architect. In Japan, there is a very interesting thing. You basically only have 6 big construction companies in Japan. By the way, since the 18th century. There is one from the 19th, but all the others are from the 18th century. But what do you have in Japan? You have this constant construction. First, because the country was destroyed and had to be rebuilt. But then there is also a very curious legislation that changes the rules all the time. And that's why it's cheaper to destroy the building and build a new one than to restore the one that exists, because the new legislation for earthquakes, etc., make the old building an illegal building. By the way, we are all watching with dismay the destruction of one of the most emblematic buildings in Tokyo that is being destroyed, by the way, this week, the capsules of Kurokawa, which is a very sad thing. But in fact, the building has become illegal because it was built in the 60s for the regulation of earthquakes of the 60s. To restore it, it would cost a fortune, and so it's going to be destroyed. But this logic is compensated by another thing, is that since there is lots of construction, there's lots of space for young architects. And on top of it, since architecture has become somehow a symbol, the quality of architecture is a symbol of the country, and not only the architectural quality, but also the quality of the building itself, which is amazing. Very often, these large construction companies, what they do is that they hire a very famous architect that has a small office, that has 20 people, 15 people, and they bring them to their offices that have 4,000 architects, 5,000 architects, and they develop the project together. So it's obvious that the smaller architect, be it one of the great, like Sejima, etc., that only have like 50 or 60 people in their office, but when they work with the construction company, it's good for both. First, because a small office, like in most countries in the world, cannot participate in a competition, because normally competitions always say you have to have built 12 museums to be able to enter this competition, I mean, which is completely absurd, but most countries have these rules, no? But when you unite construction companies and architects, you can have architects that build large-scale building and then continue with their small-scale office, and eventually will be called for another one if it's successful. So I think Japan is interesting not only because of its the beauty of its architecture, the originality, the diversity, it's really amazing, but because also there is this understanding between the big building companies and the small, brilliant architects.
Very interesting insight. I really didn't know this. So yes, so I think that gives us a lot of hope, because I think we are also in India in the same state of churn as to how we can get better architecture and also more competent, faster, better quality buildings. So which probably only the better construction companies can deliver, but then the better designs, of course, the better architects can deliver. So that marriage is very important, and it's very, very nice that you could actually bring it out. So with that, I would just put a end note to this. I just want to say that with each succeeding year, one finds that Pritzker is actually sending out a very strong message. And every time in an institution like this, we are talking about what next, how are we going to do it going forward, and every time Pritzker is just sending one knock, tang, that's one way to do it. So this time it was really amazing that we got to see Pritzker award going to somebody who's actually building down-to-earth buildings.
By the way, you have to invite him. You should
yes, we are in the process already. We are already in the process, and I think very soon we'll have the benefit. Of course, we are way below in the priority list because there's a man much in demand. So with that, I think we'll close this chat. I'm sorry, guys, I couldn't offer you a chance to stand up and ask questions, but maybe we will have some other medium to do that. Okay, and of course, ambassador is always here. We can always request him to some more time.
Yes, please, if there is one or two questions.
So I think we won't. We will not go with one or two because it might just roll over too long. So thank you, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I'm sure we've all learned a lot more than we knew about the Pritzker Prize and more. I would like to call Professor Dr. Anil Devan, sir. So,
Maybe, sir, you stay here for a moment.
so we would like you all for joining us and would like to honor you by handing you
So all of
a
you,
memento.
I guess we would like to give you souvenirs in the form of seminars in architecture. These are books which are students. Okay. So all of you could, Professor. Yeah, you first. Yeah. I thought I was. Okay, I'll be louder. So I would like to present seminars in architecture. This is publications of our Department of Architecture. So these are sample. We have many more. So we would like to give one set each to all of you who come. Starting with you, sir. Maybe you received them before.
Excuse me. We request you all to kindly stay back and join us for high tea in the open air theatre after a vote of thanks by Dr. Anil Devan.